George Mumford, welcome to the Victory Degree Podcast.
Thanks, Nick. I'm glad to be here. It's great to be here.
George, I figured, there's a lot of places where I want to take this conversation. One of them being your new book, which I just read called Unlocked. I believe it was released last year. It was a fantastic read and a lot of takeaways from that book and a lot of topics that I want to get into eventually. But before we get into any of your teachings, any of your experiences with MJ and Kobe and the world of sports psychology, your experiences with prison inmates, and what you learned from that, and all of that good stuff, I figured a good place for us to start would be you and your 12 siblings and how that kind of set up you for the life that you ended up living.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I'll share a story. One of my friends, she's a licensed social worker, and she commented, she said, "You're really good with group therapy and working with groups and teams because you grew up in one." So being number 10 of 13, you have to share things, and you also have to figure out how to be yourself and still be included in the tribe or the family. And the way we did it was between supporting each other. So the oldest or the elders would take care of the young ones. And so there was this it's like a mentoring within the family, a mentorship where, and for me it was my two sisters. One was 2 years older than me and the other one was 4 years older than me. And they're the ones that took me to my first basketball game. It was up the street from my house. It was a high school, and they were going there for the boys, but they took me, and I benefited from from seeing my first basketball game. My older sisters took me to that, and so so it was just an experience of figuring out how to be with other people, and at the same time try to maintain your own integrity of your individual self. So I dealt with that, basically being a loner and being an early riser. So I was the first one up, and I kind of like being with myself. I was very quiet.
How would you describe your childhood? I know in the book you get into some of the issues that you had with your father and that your father had with alcohol. Can
Hmm.
you talk a little bit about that and kind of just your childhood in general?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because when you grow up in the neighborhoods I grew up, and everybody was basically going through the same thing. So, but it was challenging because we didn't have a lot of money, and I couldn't participate in some sports like Little League because my family couldn't afford it and stuff like that. But so I say the challenges were me finding my own voice. I think that was the main thing because I can imagine, being one of the elder siblings and you have another mouth to feed and another person you have to babysit and tend to and take care of. You could have a little resentment for that. I think when we were younger, some of that came out, but as we got older, there was more of a love and compassion to it. But when you're younger, you don't really know that you have a choice, and so you're just dealing with the fact that, oh man, I got to babysit my little brother, or whatever it would mean. But early childhood does affect us, and it affected me in a way where I ended up feeling like if I spoke up, I got beat up, and so I tended to be quiet. Or even if I didn't get beat up, it was like, well, your opinion doesn't matter that much. You know, you're a little dude, you're a young guy, you don't know enough. And a lot of this communication is, and it's interesting because I don't think we talk about it enough, but a lot of our communication is nonverbal, sometimes referred to as what is communicated but not said or unsaid. So you pick up, cues, and you pick up, you pick up the vibe. And so when you live in, growing up with a family like mine and living in the neighborhoods I lived in, you tend to have a sense when stuff is about to go south, when things are, when it's danger is about. So you have that reptilian brain is searching for danger all the time. So I think it affects how, how you see the world and how it affects you. And one of the way it affected me, and I grew up in Boston, and so obviously people know about the racism, but I believe there's racism, or I would say preference, everywhere. And I remember one time wondering if my family was from a foreign country or they were from the States. So I tried to look up Alabama. I thought that was I didn't know it was a state when I was younger. That's where my family came from. So it affected me in a lot of ways. And being honest about it, how I feel today is going to determine how I interpret what happened to me. And because I've evolved and learned that I get to choose how I interpret something. Something happens, and then something happens, and then I have the choice of how I interpret it. And you can interpret it predicated on whether I talk about in my book, whether I'm in survival mode, that reptilian brain I talked about, or in growth mode. And if I'm in growth mode, I'm going to see things and notice that there's some lessons that I got there. Like my friend said, you're really good with working with people, or you're really good working with people who are on the fringes because you used to be on the fringe. And you know what it feels like, and you know how you got, you could be what I would call a social contemplative. I was really programmed to be an introvert, but I can be an extrovert as well. But I need my quiet time. I need my alone downtime, and so it's an inside job. So you can have two people that can be identical twins, and they could grow up they can be in the same environment, have the same nurturing, and be different. It all depends on how they interpret their experience and how they see themselves, and how they see the world, whether they see the world as a friendly place or unfriendly place. And so all of these factors factor in. So when I reflect on my childhood, I tend to focus more on the great time. Like in my book, I refer to it as Camelot. There were some amazing experiences I had in my family. Plus, we have people that were from more affluent families, especially my older brother's friends, and they like to hang out with us because it was a feeling of community, of family, and it was a warmth there. We didn't have a lot of, like monetary stuff, but we had that value of being a family, having a home.
Can you talk a little bit about, because I know in the book you get into this whole idea of adversity and how a lot of times adversity is required for success. And, you brought up this example of a caterpillar, which I'm hoping you could maybe share with the audience. But just your general thoughts, obviously having grown up in, in the home that you did, and like you're mentioning your own adversity with, having a alcoholic father and not maybe having the monetary needs that your family needed at the time. So having gone through your own set of adversity, can you talk a little bit about, is adversity required for success, and how do we know how much adversity is good? Because I'm assuming that there's a level, right, where if you're only going through adverse situations, probably won't end up well for you. But if you go through too little adversity, that's probably also not a good thing. So how do we deal with that? And then maybe also bringing up the story of the caterpillar would help illustrate some of those points.
Yes. Well, you don't have to go looking for adversity. It's all around you. We have this, and Joseph Campbell talked about it in The Power of Myth. Every moment we have to decide, what are we going to do? What choices are we going to make? And so for me, what I noticed is, and I learned this when I was in school and we used to be in the science lab, and I know they didn't do it, but we used to have these Bunsen burners, and you had these little glass beacons, and you'd have water in it or whatever, and have a Bunsen burner be under it, and making it hot. And the idea is that if you put a frog in there and you keep the flame low, frog will stay in there and boil and roast. But if you turn the flame up high, that frog would jump out of there. And so I think that's a metaphor for us. You're going to go through struggle, even if you just think about the idea that you get born, and when you're born, you're totally helpless. You need others around you. You can't avoid feeling powerless and alone. And you get older, you age, and you get sick, and you die. I mean, life is suffering. You're going to have adversity, but the question is whether you see the adversity as a roadblock or you turn it into a stepping stone. And so there's all of these in my book. We talked about it. No struggle, no swag. You have to struggle. Even you struggle as a baby in the birth trauma, just coming out of the womb, you struggle. So life, but it's this thing about if you're looking for struggle, and some people look for struggle, but they don't call it struggle, they call it challenges. And so we have this idea of no, but if you don't have anything that you're interested in, and I would say we spend most of our time between anxiety and boredom. And we're bored when we have high skills and knowledge and experience, but we're not challenged. And we're anxious when we're challenged beyond our perceived capacity. So we have to be able to if you learn something, if you want to grow, you got to be out of your comfort zone. So you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. So adversity means many things to different people. It could be people, places, and things, or it could be the challenges or the conflicts we have inside of us. And the idea is, like in my first book, The Mindful Athlete, I called it AOF motivation. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, AOF. You have any idea what I mean by that?
I think
That
I've heard.
means
Yeah.
it means ass on fire.
Yeah.
Just like that punch. If you don't have initially for me, I got clean and sober coming up on 40 years in July because my ass was on fire. And some people you would look at them and say, well, their ass should be on fire, but it's not. So you have to get to a place where you say, it's like what was sometimes referred to, or at least in my time, it was referred to as bottom, getting rock bottom, where you can't keep doing what you're doing and you can't not do what you're doing. And you get to a place where you just have to say, I'm powerless and I have to let go. I have to let go, let God, or just trust the process and stop trying to think my way into proper behavior, but actually behave my way into proper thinking, or just doing what they tell me to do, and then see what happens. But to get out of that place of if I stay here and if I keep doing what I'm doing, and this is on any level, whether it's adversity or just excellence, if you're trying to move to another level, if I keep doing what I'm doing, I'm going to keep getting what I'm getting. So I have to change what I'm doing if I want something different. And you talked a little bit when we talked about responsibility. We have self-awareness. But first of all, we have a masterpiece. We have this tremendous potential inside of us that we can access. Number two. Number three, only we can access it. And number four, the quality of our life is going to be reflection on how much of that we embrace and say yes to. And so in my book, Unlocked, I talk about unlock, embrace the greatness, find the flow, discover success. But we have to acknowledge that we have free will. We can decide what to focus on. We can decide how to interpret something. Because we have self-awareness and we make choices, whether we choose to or not, we have this ability, and that especially if we can create space between stimulus and response. And a lot of the processes I talk about in Unlock and Mindful Athlete is about how to create space between stimulus and response. And in that space, Viktor Frankl said, we have the freedom and power to choose, but you don't have to believe him. You can just try it yourself. And so this idea of being mindful or having mirror mind or being able to observe experience uncritically, non-reactively, we get the intel we need. And then based on what goals, what core values, or what ideas or ideals we want to live up to, we can choose in alignment with that. But a lot of us don't know we have choice, that we're making choices. And so that's why the examined life is the only life worth living, because if you don't, we learn from true understanding comes from reflecting on experience. And so in sports, what's great about sports is a lot of things, but the main thing is we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you play basketball, you got you're playing in the pros, you got 4 quarters, and they're 12 minutes long. And even in football, you have 4 quarters, and then you have the 2-minute drill, and you have all of these other things. And it's amazing that there's so many touchdowns scored at the 2-minute drill at halftime and at the end of the game than most of the other game. It's because we get locked in. There's a sense of urgency, and we have a plan that we're going to follow, and then we just get locked in and we kind of do it. So we have to understand that we have this ability to be
George,
self-aware and to self-regulate. we can decide how we, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors we regulate. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the self-realization. And I'd say a lot of people are probably in situations where they're not happy. You mentioned boredom. And then you also mentioned this willingness to change and understanding that if you keep doing the same, if you keep giving your life the same inputs, you will get the same outputs. But what I'm curious is, how do people actually get to that level of self-realization to understand that they might be in a situation where they're unhappy? Because I would argue that most people go on about their lives almost like robots, right? They have these set, things that they do each and every day without not much intention behind the actions that they take. But yet they're unhappy with their lives. So, what are some techniques or some things that you've learned to help people reach that level of self-realization to make a change?
Well, you have to have a sense of urgency. So I talked about, ass on fire, but now I don't get motivated so much by that. I get motivated by pursuing excellence and wisdom with grace and ease, or realizing that if I don't want what I'm getting, then I have to be willing, ready, willing, and able to do something differently. And usually that means changing my view of what's possible for me. And so once again, I don't know how you get there without a sense of urgency, because we in my book I talk about it. Uh, uh, there's a book called The Way of Man, and Martin Buber talks about this idea that we all have a divine spark that's encrusted in a shell, and we have a system of hideouts. So we hide from ourselves, and he uses the example of uses the Bible when God is asking Adam, Adam, wherefore art thou? And he's not asking him where he is physically. He's asking him, you've had 35 years or so allotted to your life. What have you done for it? You have to take responsibility for what you've done. And so uh, Eric Fromm wrote a book called Escape from Freedom. So we have these mechanisms of escape or hiding out. And so when they ask, because when God asked him, wherefore art thou, and he hid himself, we thought he was hiding himself from God, but he can't do that. But when you hide yourself from God, you're hiding yourself from yourself. And so it's the idea of the first step is, oh, I hid myself, and then take responsibility and say, I have this ability, but escape from freedom, well, I'm escaping from freedom through authoritarianism or just conforming and not really going inside, because we're thinking everything's out here, and being my unique self. That all of us are a unique self. It's like snowflakes. There's only one of us, and our job is to embrace that and to know it so we can express it and share it with others. And so that's what the challenge is. And why is that so important? And I go back to philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. In 1846, he had this idea. He talked about, I don't necessarily have a coin with me, but he said freedom and potentiality is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is uncertainty, anxiety. And this is what Eric Fromm said. He said, if we change anything, even if we change when we brush our teeth, it mobilizes anxieties. That's the thing. So we don't talk about it. And you know what Kierkegaard called it? He called it the alarming possibility of being able. That's it. But Viktor Frankl talked about it when he talked about this idea that this is where we are, this is where we're going, and in between there's tension. And so you have this idea, positive psychology is great, but to say that you're not going to suffer, you're not going to have some discomfort, that's just not realistic. And so you can call that stress, you can call that tension, whatever. It doesn't matter what you call it. It has to be endured. And this is what Rollo May Eric Fromm was saying about when you change something and anxieties get mobilized, they're to be embraced and work, and you just work through it. You walk through it, and you get stronger. But if you don't do that, and if you avoid it, you hide out and you deny and blame, then it could become neurotic or psychotic. But you experience anxiety. It's there. It's part of life. But if you can embrace it and notice that it's teaching you, if anything, it's telling you you're out of your comfort zone. And it's because the reality is that the future is unknown. But we don't act like that. We don't act like you're going to get old, you're going to die, you're going to get sick. We don't act like that. So when somebody dies or gets sick or gets old, we act like it's not supposed to happen, but it is. But it's happening. And so if you embrace it, then it's like you're going to die or you're going to lose what you have. That you have to keep reinventing yourself, because that's how I won't say matriculate, but that's how we evolve. Evolution is about, if you don't change, you become extinct, you might say. You get what I'm saying? So this is a much deeper question. So when we ask these questions, why do people do that? You have to go into the individual. But I would say, from my own experience and from being a human being and what is required, what has to be overcome to actualize, or to realize that you have the potential inside, you have to be willing to look at it and deal with the discomfort. So once again, in my book, The Mindful Athlete, I talk about, and I think I talk about it Unlocked as well, you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And so anytime you grow, to learn something means you don't just take in facts, you actually change. It actually changes how you're approaching life or how you're doing something. So the know and not the act is not the know. So when you know something, you got to show you know. If that makes sense. And so now it's a totally different thing. But we don't have that around us. We don't have anybody that says, well, okay, so you might not be good in math or English, but you have, you have this, spatial intelligence, or you have this, emotional intelligence, or you have spiritual intelligence. You have some other intelligence that you can pursue. We have one size fits all and say, oh, you should be like Johnny or be like Mary, instead of saying, no, you should be yourself. And that means that you're going to have to do a lot of self-study, because a lot of this stuff is just fit for one size. It's almost like a assembly line. But the reality is, each person has to take responsibility for themselves and realize that I have everything I need to succeed, but it's an inside job.
George, in talking about freedom, that's one of the themes that constantly come up in your book. And you talked about Kobe's jump shot, and you use that as a metaphor for freedom. Can you explain to the audience Kobe's jump shot and
Yeah,
how that relates to freedom?
yeah. So I'll just say this. So there's what we tend to do. We emulate other people, and I saw this when I was fooling around playing the guitar, or having friends and my brother playing instruments. When you get an instrument, you emulate somebody else. You practice, you do their song or whatever, and until you get your own, you develop your own process. So how you do that is being in touch with your body and just noticing and just allowing yourself to express itself, so that you're doing it in a way that's unique for you, that makes sense for you. So even though we say you should shoot, there's certain principles involved, but your individual uniqueness, what feels right to you, that's what you have to do. And so we could talk about the mechanics of the jump shot, but what we really need to understand is, how did they manifest? They manifested from this idea of being in this body, and being mindful, and that still small voice that's inside. It's easily drowned out. There's a knowing, and this is what I talk about a lot. And Joseph Campbell talked about it in The Power of Myth, when he said, when the athlete is in championship form, he comes from this place of rest, or this, I call it the eye of the hurricane. But when you come from that place of rest, you're not compelled by fear or desire. You're just holding your center and then focusing on what you're doing. And so there's a freedom there, right? But freedom ain't free, because you get the dizziness of freedom. You have the anxiety that comes with it. You also get the haters, because let's be real. The world will tell us who they think we should be or ought to be, but it's up to us to decide who we are, not to let the world tell us who we are. And when you do that, you're gonna get pushback. You get pushback from your parents, your friends, because reality is, when you change, they have to change, or the relationship changes. So you feel me? You get what I'm saying? So it's complicated. It's simple, but it's complicated. And so it takes a certain amount of trust to be able to be vulnerable enough to allow yourself to be what you need to be. And I saw this movie called Finding Forrester, I think is the name, and it was with Sean Connery, and I forget the actor's name. But he was living in the hood, and he liked poetry and stuff, but he couldn't share it with his fellas. Couldn't share it because he didn't want, because it was so out of the norm of being in the hood and hanging out with the fellas. But then once he went he went to a school, and even in the school there, he was typecast like, okay, this is black dude, but he shouldn't be here, or he doesn't have any artistic ability, or he's not a poet, or he doesn't have whatever it is. And the idea is he had to have mentors around him and people around him, role models around him that allowed him to say it's okay for you to be you. And that's the other thing. We don't have people around that are saying, we need you to be you. And if you go, and you could talk about it. And some of the philosophers talk about it. They say when you go before Saint Peter, he's not going to ask you why were you not like Moses. He's going to ask you why were you not like Nick. Once again, it's God saying, wherefore art thou? It's like, where are you in your life? So you have to take, and that's the first step, is taking responsibility. I hid myself, or I'm hiding in plain sight, doing what everybody else is doing instead of being true to thine own self, be true. Know the truth, and truth shall make you free. This is about, but freedom ain't free, and you got to have a a really firm foundation, is what Eric Fromm, was it Eric Fromm that said this? He calls it frames of orientation and devotion. You have to have some way of observing experience in a way where you can be vulnerable, and you can embrace the unfolding unknown moment as it comes. Like the future is not guaranteed, but you can create an opportunity where no matter what happens in that space between stimulus and response, you get to choose the freedom and power to choose. This is what Viktor Frankl says: when you get unavoidable freedom, it doesn't matter. He was in a concentration camp. You get to choose the attitude. You get to choose how you interpret what it means.
George, I want to take us to some of the work that you did with Phil Jackson and the Bulls. And there was one particular thing that stuck out to me in your book when talking about, working with Phil and the Chicago Bulls. You joined the Bulls right after MJ left. So it was kind of this in-between period for them where they were like, okay, well, arguably the greatest basketball player of all time just left our team. And now, what's next? What's going to happen? And so some of the work that you did with them is you would tell them, and I quote from your book, that you taught them to compete against their previous best self. The opponent comes second.
That's right.
Can you explain what that means?
Yes. So and in psychology and sports psychology as well, we talk about the locus of control. So the locus of control is either external, means people, places, and things control us, or internal. The real locus of control is internally, and you can control that. You can't control the externals. And so the idea was, it was interesting because at that time I was working in the Department of Preventive and Behavioral Medicine at the UMass Medical Center. It was a stress reduction clinic. So what happened was I got there and they were in full blown crisis. And so my conversation in that situation with anybody is, okay, something happens, and how you interpret it is really important. And elite performers, when something like that happens, they see it as a challenge. And so when a crisis is present, it has two meanings: opportunity and danger. And so you can focus on the danger, which everybody gets, but the opportunity is like, okay, Michael is not here. Everybody's got to step up. And, back in those days, I wouldn't say this, but Vin Diesel would say something like, don't get up if you can't keep up, right? Or step up or step aside, right? No struggle, no swag. Privilege, pressure is a privilege. No pressure, no diamonds. Something like that, where you say, listen, man, seize the moment, man. There's something here for you to get. And so that was my conversation with them. And it was like, you got to begin where you are. So this is where you are. And once again, you want to get to this point. So you got to endure that tension or stress that's there, what we call eustress. It's a positive stress, not distress. But it's still going to be stressful. But if you embrace it, you might discover the joy of discovery. You might realize that when you embrace your greatness, you find the flow and you discover success. That's it. So that was the conversation. It was about that. And that's what I did. And that's what I've been doing. It's like, okay, I have this chronic pain. And how am I going to relate to it? Can I see it as a roadblock or a stepping stone? See it as a stepping stone. That's a choice. And so I talked to them about that. We're in full-blown crisis, but there's opportunity here. Let's focus on the opportunity. We're aware of the danger, but the opportunity is where the opportunity is. That's where the growth is. That's where, and the other thing that's so amazing about this, Nick, is when you have adversity and when you get challenged like that, it helps your latent abilities express themselves. So think about that. So this guy, Hans Selye, he wrote the book, The Stress of Life, and he came up with stress and eustress. And he said in his book, he talked about this idea that when we get confronted with these crises or with these challenges, if you want to look at it that way, it helps. It creates space for our latent abilities to express themselves. Abilities we didn't even think we had. They get expressed. And so if I think of Michael Jordan, people don't realize he got cut from his high school basketball team. And, of course, he grew, but the main thing was the coach said to him, okay, what are you going to do? There's an opportunity for you to, get up early and we'll go work out and you can work on your game. And so by the time I saw him in the 90s when I was working with the Bulls, he acted like he was still trying to make the team. See, because he realized no one's going to outwork me and I need to earn everything I get. Now, and it wasn't like he was doing it with, like was that vigilance, like waiting for things, but it was more like, no, that was the lesson I learned. Is that you got to work for this, and you don't stay still. You have to keep evolving, and you're once again, and I'm comparing myself to my previous best self. Why? Because I can only control that. But the other part of that is if you think about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Wilt Chamberlain, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar broke Wilt's scoring record. What Wilt said was, if I knew anybody had a chance of breaking that record, I would have put it way out of sight. So he didn't. He was comparing himself to people around him at that era instead of comparing himself to his previous best self, where he could have taken it to the point where maybe Kareem probably wouldn't be able to get there. So I'm going back to what you said about that's why it's important comparing yourself to your previous self, and all you need is 1% improvement, just a little bit, increments. It can be doable but hard to do, and you can manage that. If it gets too much than that, then the anxiety will overcome you. But a little anxiety is healthy. A little struggle is healthy. When you're going to meet challenges, if you want to call them that, but you're going to have adversity. It just comes with it, and you can see when you have adversity. Sometimes that's when that's when your latent abilities express themselves, because the possibility or the opportunity is there. Necessity is the mother of invention. And so sometimes we invent things or we do things because it's called for. And we meet the challenge. We say, yes, this is happening. And what's the lesson? What do I need to learn here? Where's the opportunity?
You mentioned in your book that Kobe and MJ were some of your best meditation students. And I thought that was interesting because you then went on to talk about how MJ and Kobe had this beginner's mindset where, you know, if somebody, listen, if I were MJ or Kobe, it'd be easy for me to say, I know everything. I'm the best. There's nothing left for me to learn. There's no teacher that can teach me something I don't know. But they were actually the exact opposite of that. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about why they were some of your best meditation students and kind of why that beginner's mindset is so important.
Yes. So there's books on this. One book is called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. But I want to refer to the great and late Bruce Lee. And he was teaching two actors. He had private lessons, and one was James Coburn, and the other one was Steve McQueen. And he would say that Steve McQueen had the physicality, and the other guy had the the discipline and whatever. And so he was teaching them one day at his home, and he had a teapot and he had a teacup, and he was pouring tea into the teacup. Like, just imagine that I'm pouring water in here, and then it starts spilling all over the place. And he said, a full cup can receive nothing, an empty cup can receive everything. And so it's another way, and that's a big part of the practice, is to be able to see things in fresh and new ways, to have a beginner's mind, a don't know mind, a mind that's inquiring and looking at things as if it's looking at what it looks at every day with fresh eyes and new ways. And so that's what's meant by that. And believe it or not, novelty is a flow trigger. That's what triggers flow, just not knowing or seeing things in new and fresh ways. And so they were coachable. I would say they were both humble and hungry, humble and hungry. So they being humble, humble. And it's interesting because Joseph Campbell talks about it in his book, The Power of Myth. He says, those who think they know don't know, and those who know don't know. And so it's as simple as, if I were to ask you a question, and I learned this in the 8th grade, one of my neighbors said to me, "Do you know what you don't know?" I thought that was profound. But more profound than that is, do you know there's things you don't know you don't know? That's even wider. So think about that. You might know what you don't know, but that assumes that you know things. Like you might say, okay, neuroscience, I don't know as much as I need to know. But what I'm talking about, there's things that you don't even know that you don't know. And so, and if you've seen the eclipse last week, you realize that, wow, there's this great universe, there's billions of galaxies. I mean, come on, man, it's unfathomable. It's beyond, it's infinitesimal, the things.
Right.
So, we're just a little speck if you really think about it. So our job is, yeah, I'm not where I want to be. So and that's what separated, I believe, MJ from others, is his will, the will to win. And some people will look at it like winning at all costs. That's part of it, but it's really pursuing excellence and seeing that he's willing to go as far as he can go. And I remember Scottie Pippen telling me near the end there in 1990, he said Michael has stuff he hasn't even shown yet. I mean, that's it, right? And writing the book Unlocked, I'm pretty sure I got unlocked in a lot of ways, but one of the ways I got unlocked was realizing that the reason I got along so well with those guys, because I had that Mamba mentality. I had that same tenacity to do things in ways, doing things that no one else was doing, or they wouldn't even think about doing, because I had that hunger and that humility, and I'm a seeker. So I want to understand. I want to see how far I can push that out. So I won't have regrets like Chamberlain and saying, well, if I'd have known that, I would have kept getting evolving. But he didn't, because he was so much better than anybody else that he didn't see the locus of control was external. You get what I'm saying? It's like you're looking around to see people, especially Russell retired. I mean, he didn't really have much competition till he got older. Instead of saying, no, it's about me taking the game to a whole level. It's beyond me. There's something about this, seeing how far we can move this out, how far we can evolve. Does that make sense? And
Yeah,
I'm
and
not judging him or anything, but his locus of control was external. It's not the judgment. It's a reflection of how people are seeing things. It's a reflection that a lot of times we're comparing against somebody else, and when you do that, you're going to be less than or more than. But if you compare yourself to your previous best self, you're evolving, and you're matriculating in a way where you're going to feel good about yourself. And you, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you win or lose. You can always feel like a winner when you know you gave everything. You were fully deployed and fully engaged and fully self-expressed. And if you don't win, you don't win. But that's a winner when you can go out and say, I got better today.
George, you
Does that make
mentioned,
sense? What you asked me?
yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And I wanted to go back to your own career. And you mentioned in your book that you never thought you'd be a trailblazer. And I think at one point you were sitting behind the Bulls bench and you were like, how did I get here? How did I get into this position to be working with MJ and Phil Jackson? So I'm curious if you can expand on that and kind of your mindset as you went along in your own career.
Well, for me, it was organic. It was more like, okay, I started reflecting, and this is what happens when you're not in the hamster wheel, whether you're chasing drugs or money or whatever it is, um, and you have time to reflect, because true understanding comes on reflecting on our experience. And so I was just reflecting and knowing that how not many people get clean and sober when they're addicted. And I thought I was going to die, being a substance abuser, jails, institutions, or death. And I was able to get out of that addiction. And so I asked, well, I was able to do it, and why, or how can other people do it? And so I got really interested in, because what I discovered when I came to, if you will, when I became more, I wasn't hiding out. I was present and embracing the moment. Wanted to understand how I did it and how other people could do it. So, and I learned early on that if you want to learn something, you have to teach it. And if you want to keep something, you have to give it away. And so that's when I got into it, and I started thinking about it and reflecting on, oh, if I could do it, other people could do it. And I knew it was really about connecting to higher power, or connecting to the power source within. As you talked about the chrysalis, if when you're a caterpillar and you go into that shell, it's interesting. Instead of being a shell to hide out, it's a shell that helps you break out, right? You have to struggle to get out. And the struggle is really important. Why? Because there was a story about this young boy who found the chrysalis, and he could see the little being inside trying to get out. And he took it home, and he took scissors, and he helped the little being out. And when the being got out, it was ill formed, and it couldn't fly, and it died. It just fell to the ground. So what's the lesson? The story is, it's by him struggling to get out, he develops the strength to fly. So that's a metaphor for us. That no struggle, no swag. No struggle, no fly. That's what it's at. But you don't have to look for it. It's there. It's there if you're willing to embrace and say, this is what it is. You know, like it remind me of that Kool and the Gang song. What you going to do? Are you going to get down? What you going to do? The question is, as Vin Diesel would say, step up, or don't get up. If you can't keep up, don't get up, or step up or step aside. It's that. Life is saying to George, what are you going to do? Are you going to embrace, say yes to it, and allow yourself to express yourself honestly, or are you going to say no and then stay hidden, and stay, and not be who you are?
George, in your own career, besides working with MJ and Kobe and Phil Jackson and getting to be around those teams, one of the more interesting parts of your career was the work that you did with prison inmates. And even more interesting than that were the similarities that you found between working with prison inmates and then working with world championship teams. So I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit on some of the similarities you found and kind of just your general experience working with prison inmates.
Yes. So here's the interesting thing: no matter where you are, who you are, you have a masterpiece within. You have that greatness I talked about that you have to embrace. And so that's where the similarities are, is but how you direct attention, how you develop and use your self-awareness, how you develop your ability to self-regulate. That's the ability to regulate your thoughts, feelings, behaviors, even how you interpret things. And so I had some of the folks that were in jail, especially when I was working at this one facility where they were doing double life or life. They weren't ever getting out. They used to thank me for coming in. And when I went in there, I could talk to them about anything, because they knew, just like Viktor Frankl knew when he was in the concentration camps, he may not have liberty, but he's the one that chooses what resides in his mind, what he focuses on, and what kind of quality of his life he can have internally. And so, yeah, so it was interesting for me, because when I would go in there were guys in the class that I used to get high with. And it was a recognition for me that had I not got my act clean, I'd probably be there with them. But I was able to change so that I didn't get to that. And I was a functional. I still worked and everything. I was fortunate enough to do that. But it was the same deal. It was like, the only time you have is now. The only person you could be is you. And all you really need is love. And you could say, how can you live in love in this environment? Because when the first time I went into a prison, just in the gatehouse, before you even go into the prison, it was so oppressive. It took me 4 days of meditating and praying just to get back to normal. I'm very sensitive, so I could see that. So I'm saying, these folks, even the correction officers, they're living in that energy 24/7, or for a significant part of the day. And so helping them to be able to find a refuge. be able to find a place where they could be at rest. Joseph Campbell talked about, and even though the environment's this way, you still can be in that eye of the hurricane and not be in the whirlwinds, be in it. And that's extremely challenging, but it's very doable. And sometimes that's all they had because they didn't have anything else. And some of them were willing to talk to young kids and other people to try to prevent them from getting where they are and sharing their experience, strength, and hope on how they ended up being in prison, doing double life or whatever. And so it's interesting because I work with all types of inmates, and the ones sometimes they could be in denial about being in prison for 10 years. You say, how's that possible? Well, the mind can do a lot of things. But when you've been in there for as long as these guys have, there's no denial about being there. And you have to embrace it. It's like everything else. You say yes to it, you embrace it, you generate the hope, and then you figure out how am I going to create space between stimulus and response, and what kind of life, what kind of values am I going to align myself with?
As we go back at this question, I just thought of this. Thinking back about athletes and being the sports fan that I am, we talked about my love for the Sacramento Kings and being a fan for them for as long as I have. One of the things that I always think about, and in thinking about your work, is you worked with MJ in the 90s, you worked with Kobe in the 2000s, and now we're in the 2020s, and you're still working with athletes. I'm curious from your perspective, how have the struggles of these athletes evolved, and how are they different now versus what they were back in the 90s?
Okay, so it's interesting. So it goes back further than that. I room with Dr. J in the 70s, and I used to go see, go visit him play when he played, and whatnot. So it goes further than that. But every change is constant. Right now, it's accelerated. With technology, globalization, and just yeah, it's technical. It's just things are changing rapidly. Things are changing faster, and down with AI is changing even faster. So it's different. So this is why having a beginner's mind is really important, because even within that decade, even from year to year, you can have the same team come back. You get the full team back, which is very unusual. You can't do that, because when you win a championship, people go, they get a big contract or whatever. But even like they say, you can't step in the same river twice. So everything's changing. Even if you have everybody that was there before, everything's changed. So you have to keep evolving and changing. And so one of the things that I feel, and it's interesting because I don't know how old you are, but if you would talk to your parents or your grandparents, they would tell you something like, yeah, well, the elders used to talk about walking to school 5 miles each way, or have to live in an outhouse or having a gas lip. So everybody's saying the new generation doesn't know what hard work is or what struggle is, because things are so easy for you. You can do all that stuff. So there's kind of that. But for me, my own experience, maybe this will enlighten you on that. When when I was in when Julius became pro and he was working, he got he was playing for the Virginia Squires, and my other roommate at the time, my new roommate was Al Skinner, who always also played on the basketball team, also played with Julius and Philly. So my two roommates played in the pros. I didn't. Um, and Al and I were going down on spring break to hang out with Julius, and we're driving down to Virginia, and he has this little Volkswagen Beetle, and I think it was green or blue. I forget what color it was, but anyway, we're driving down, and we come into North Carolina, and there's a big sign that says you are now entering Klan country. And in those days, you still had faucets to say white only, whites only, blacks only. That was still relevant. That was still going on, and so our position was, we're going to see our buddy. We don't have time to worry about that sign. But that's the kind of toughness that you had to have. Hold on, just I don't know what happened. I'm in a hotel room, so the TV was making a sound. So that's just, and then there's other things. There were certain things, when I think of my own experience. I know it's challenging for people to hear, but it was a different world back then. I remember some of my classmates going down to down south to help people register. And you've seen people getting killed trying to do that. You've seen Medgar Evers, you've seen Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, JFK. There was a lot of violence, and it was very challenging times. And so that's very different. So each generation goes through different things. And so it's different. So it's always about, and I think there's something to be said that things are getting better on some level, with technology. It's not like, one of the houses we had, it had like things for gas, like gas lit, that kind of stuff. So and then you can see in some of the institutions, they have these kind of like these metal rods outside. And what that meant is it was an old building that they had to put electric wires in. So the electric wires were on the outside. And so you can see the matriculation of life, and everybody's different. And now you have, like, another thing is, when I was playing sports, we had maybe 2 or 3 different brands of basketball sneakers or tennis shoes, whatever you want to call it. Now they got hundreds. And so just think about that, the overwhelm. I was talking to one of my friends, and her son, who I like to send texts to, she said he gets 200 or 300 texts a day. And that's not talking about TikTok or the other social media. So it's totally different. So I hope that answered your question. So the thing is, you always have to come back to the basic fundamentals of, can you be in the moment? Can you be yourself? Can you have a growth mindset, so you're learning and evolving? And that's the challenge. So it doesn't matter. I'm still working with elite athletes and elite performers in business and whatnot. And yeah, how I relate to them is not the same way I related to Michael and Kobe, or Julius. Everybody was different, and I see the lineage: Julius, Michael, Kobe, and I did a little work with Melo when I was working with the Bulls. So I see that lineage, working with in different eras. Okay, and you can see it. And even now, working with young kids and working with elite performers in the NHL, or the NFL, or in the Premier League, I work with all those folks, and it's different. But it's the same, because you have a mind, body, a heart, soul, and spirit. You're a whole person, and how you direct attention, how you use your self-awareness and self-regulation that leads to self-mastery. It's the same. It's just a different context, but it's the same drill.
George, I have one last question for you, because I know you have to run. And then we have a little tradition that we do here on the Victory Degree podcast with every episode. So we'll end it with that. But first, the question.
Okay.
You taught a lot of athletes, a lot of things. But I'm curious, if you were to take one piece of advice from any athlete that you've worked with, one piece of advice that they gave you that left a mark, or you have remembered all of these years, what would that one piece of advice be?
I think be you, I think. And sometimes you're talking about advice that they gave me or how they reflect on me. So I think they would say different things, but the main thing I would say is, that's interesting, because I don't think they gave me, in terms of giving me advice, but I'll just tell you what comes to mind when you ask me that question: the joy of discovery that they get and seeing them unlock. That's what I remember, even if it's just for a little bit. And then there's thousands of people. There's many organizations I work with where they didn't really embrace what I was offering. So when you see somebody embrace it and get it, and the light bulb turns on, that's what I remember. And so the advice, I would say, unconsciously given me is, keep being you, keep doing what you're doing, because it helps us.
So now we have to end it with this little tradition. And George, this has been a fantastic conversation, but there's one last thing that we need to do. So on every one of these episodes, I ask my current guest to leave a piece of advice for the next guest. The only catch is that you do not know who the next guest is going to be. So you're essentially leaving advice for a stranger. And so the last guest that we had on the Victory Degree podcast was Josh Dobbs. And his advice for you, not knowing that you're going to be coming on next, Josh's advice for you was trust the process. In that trust, you learn a lot about yourself. You put yourself out there. You bet on your own skills and abilities. And by doing that, you'll be grateful that you trusted in your own skills and abilities and put yourself in those uncomfortable situations. So I'm curious, George, what that advice means to you, and then what is your piece of advice for our next guest?
Yeah, it's like trust the process. That's really another way of saying it's a friendly universe, and if you align yourself with how things work, things are gonna be great. And so the advice I would have for the next guest is to thine own self be true. Know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So you got to be you. You can't be anybody else. So just or be more my book. Embrace your greatness. Find the flow, discover success. That's it. But I do a YouTube almost every week, mostly every week. Sometimes I'm traveling and I don't get it done. But I say over the last 4 years, I probably missed maybe 4 or 5 Thursdays or something like that. In the podcast, I talk about say yes to life, embrace everything, and generate the hope. So the thing is, you got to embrace the moment. Embrace the moment is the advice I have.
Love it. What a beautiful way to end this podcast. George, I can't thank you enough for your time. This has been awesome. All of your links will be in the description to your social media, to your book, The
Okay.
Mindful Athlete, and Unlocked. George, this has been great, and I wish you the best of luck with everything that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and I appreciate the listening you and the questions. Very helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Until next time, George.